Have you ever been in one of those conversations, where someone just dismisses graphic novels as, like, just picture
Oh,
books?
yeah. Or for kids, maybe. Or even worse, just superhero stories.
Exactly. Well, if that sounds familiar, get ready, because today we are taking a real deep dive into the, well, surprisingly complex and incredibly rich world of graphic novels.
Mhm.
We're going to unpack why these unique works are so often misunderstood, and crucially, what you might be missing by dismissing them out of hand.
It's a really important conversation to have.
Totally. So whether you're a longtime fan, maybe someone who's never picked one up, or, even if you're a bit of a skeptic, prepare for some genuine aha moments today.
Hopefully quite a few.
Our mission here is basically to pull back the curtain on this whole literary merit debate that swirls around graphic novels. And we're going to use a fantastic stack of articles and research that you've shared with us.
And what's truly compelling here, I think, is that this isn't just about entertainment, valuable as entertainment is. We're actually talking about a significant shift in how we define and consume literature in general.
That's a big claim.
It is, but think about it, especially in a world that is, well, increasingly flooded with visual information. What's striking is how this whole debate echoes similar patterns throughout history.
So it's not the first time a new medium has caused a stir.
Not at all. We'll connect the dots between past controversies, the ones surrounding other new media forms, and the present-day challenges graphic novels face. It really reveals that this debate is, in many ways, a recurring pattern. It happens whenever new forms of storytelling emerge and, well, challenge our existing definitions of what counts as valuable and legitimate literature.
Okay, so let's kick things off by looking at the current landscape, because it really seems like graphic novels have finally arrived, doesn't it?
It does feel that way sometimes.
I mean, they're everywhere now. You see them so much, particularly in schools. It looks like educators have truly embraced them, which feels like such a stark contrast to how their, let's say, older sibling, the comic book, was openly scorned not that long ago.
Right, there was definite scorn. But you're right, appearances can be deceiving.
Exactly. And one of the first major assumptions identified in our sources, this is specifically from Melanie Hundley in the Annalen Review, is that graphic novels are primarily used in education as a means to an end.
A means to an end. Okay, what does that really mean in practice?
Well, it suggests they're often seen as just a tool, right? A stepping stone, maybe, to achieve other objectives that are perceived as, quote, more worthwhile.
Okay, so like using them to help kids who struggle with reading.
Precisely. That's a big one. Educators are frequently encouraged to use them to scaffold students who struggle with traditional reading and writing. And there's research backing that up from people like Bitz, Free and Fisher, Morrison, Bryan, and Chilcote.
Makes sense.
They're also seen as great for fostering visual literacy. Frey and Fisher have highlighted that a lot.
Which is obviously important today.
Definitely. And they're useful for supporting English language learners. That's something Ranker explored. And maybe the most common reason you hear, motivating those reluctant readers. Crawford and Dorrell talked about that.
The reluctant reader category, always looking for ways to engage them.
So ultimately, this whole approach often positions graphic novels as just a bridge, something that leads students to engage with what's seen as more traditional, and the implication is clearly more valuable forms of literature.
Right, the real books.
Yeah. And while those educational goals are, they're undoubtedly good goals, it's easy to see why teachers would grab onto something that seems to help with so many different needs.
But there's a downside.
Exactly. Hundley argues this approach unintentionally perpetuates a really long-standing misperception. It subtly reinforces the idea that comics, whether comic books or graphic novels, are somehow less complex, less sophisticated reading material.
So they become the stuff for the weaker readers.
That's the implication. Best suited for weaker readers or struggling students. It's like saying graphic novels are just training wheels, Never the actual bicycle. They're seen as a temporary aid on the way to real reading, not the destination itself.
And this perception, it has really deep roots, doesn't it? Where did it actually come from?
Good question.
Well, if you look at the larger arc of history, this isn't new at all.
Yeah.
We can trace this whole professional debate, as the sources call it, all the way back to the 1940s. That was a period when comic books just, well, exploded in popularity across the U.S.
Exploded how? Like, how big are we talking?
Think about the scale. In 1938, Superman debuts, right? Iconic moment. Just 2 years later, by 1940, the number of distinct comic books published in the U.S. soared from maybe 150 titles to around 700 titles annually.
Wow, 700 in 2 years.
Yeah, a huge increase. David Hajdu documented this, and obviously this rapid growth didn't go unnoticed, especially by folks who were concerned about public morality and, the perceived decline of literary standards.
The usual suspects, perhaps.
Pretty much. And one of the earliest and definitely loudest critics who really set the tone for decades of debate was Sterling North. He was a literary critic for the Chicago Daily News.
Okay. What did he say?
In an editorial from May 1940, famously titled A National Disgrace, he didn't just disapprove, he chastised comic books, declared them, and this is the direct quote, badly drawn, badly written, and badly printed.
Ouch. No holding back there.
None at all.
Oh.
And his proposed solution was pretty drastic, very indicative of the anxieties of the time. He insisted parents and teachers were, quote, obliged to break the comic magazine habit.
Break the habit. Like forbid them.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
And substitute them with what he called quality literature, specifically the classics. He insisted the classics were full of humor and adventure, plus good writing.
Ah, the good writing argument.
Right. He even went so far as to say that not doing this was criminal negligence.
Criminal negligence. That's extreme.
It really was. And the impact. His newspaper reportedly got over 25 million requests to reprint that editorial.
25 million. That's staggering. It clearly struck a nerve.
It absolutely did. And notice, this early criticism wasn't just about the content, the superhero stories or whatever. It fundamentally focused on the perceived aesthetic lack of value of the medium itself. That set a powerful, long-lasting precedent for how these forms would be viewed, framing them as inherently inferior.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting, right? Because despite that huge public outcry and the really scathing criticism from people like North, some educators back in the 40s actually took a more tolerant view, albeit still quite limited.
Tolerant, but maybe not exactly enthusiastic.
Right. They recognized that kids were undeniably interested in comics, and they tried to use that interest as a foundation for building literacy skills.
Pragmatic, at least.
Yeah. For instance, there was E.J. Dias, a high school English teacher. He wrote this fascinating article in 1946 called Comic Books, A Challenge to the English Teacher.
A challenge, huh?
Yeah, he opened it by highlighting the big challenge that these new media have. He specifically mentioned movies, radio, and comic books pose for literacy educators. He acknowledged how much these things were shaping students' minds and interests.
So he wasn't just dismissing them out of hand.
No, instead of just condemning them, he took this pragmatic, almost strategic approach. He actually called his efforts missionary work among his comic book heathens, which is quite a phrase.
Wow. Yeah, it tells you something about the mindset.
It does. He explained how he talked to students about the comics they were reading, but his intention wasn't to celebrate the comics themselves. It was to figure out the genres they liked.
Ah, okay. So if they liked adventure comics.
Exactly. Then he'd recommend traditional literature novels, maybe that he thought might have a similar appeal. He argued this let him build on their existing interests and use comics constructively as a stepping stone to a lasting interest in good literature.
The stepping stone again.
Always the stepping stone. And others shared a similar, if equally limited, vision. Harriet Lee, teaching freshman English in 1942, she encouraged students to critically assess the literary merit of their favorite comics, seeing it as a way to encourage discrimination in reading.
So teaching critical thinking about them, but not necessarily valuing them.
Precisely. And then, in 1944, W.W.D. Soanes, an education professor, highlighted the instructional value of comics, suggesting that they could support slow readers and motivate non-academic students, basically, our reluctant readers again. He saw them as vehicles to realize the purposes of the school, like improving reading or language development.
A truly compelling aspect here, though, is that even these more, let's say, tolerant educators were united by a shared crucial flaw in their perspective.
Which was?
They showed, and the sources are clear on this, little regard for their aesthetic value.
Yeah.
They genuinely couldn't recognize any real literary merit in comic books as an art form in themselves.
So still just tools.
Purely tools. They regarded them as a way station on a journey whose ultimate purpose was to lead students to transact with traditional literature. That's a direct quote highlighting the view.
A way station, like a rest stop on the highway to real books.
Exactly. Not the destination. One English teacher put it very starkly. Comic books were a stepping stone to the realms of good literature, the literature that is the necessary and rightful heritage of the adolescent. The very language suggests this clear hierarchy, this belief that some forms are just inherently superior.
So, what does this history tell us when we look at today? Does that perspective still linger?
It really does. When we bring this into the present day, we see that this stepping stone or tool argument for graphic novels, well, it hasn't entirely vanished. Not by a long shot.
Even with famous ones like Marius.
Even with highly acclaimed graphic novels like Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which won a Pulitzer Prize, let's not forget, and Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis, which are widely recognized and studied in academic circles. Even then, the underlying tool argument still often relegates them to a secondary role in the classroom.
Still secondary.
And this continues to fuel a persistent skepticism within the educational community. Hilary Shute, a key scholar in the field, noted back in 2008 this negative reaction many in the academy have to the notion of literary comics as objects of inquiry.
So even academics were resistant.
Oh, absolutely. Kimberly Campbell, an experienced language arts teacher, she recalled colleagues expressing actual concern that graphic novels don't provide the rigor that novels require.
The rigor argument, we hear that a lot.
We do. And some high school teachers, for example, have admitted they're unwilling to use graphic novels with students in honors classes. They fear the ramifications, worrying it might somehow diminish the intellectual challenge or prestige of their curriculum.
Which begs the question, why? Why is this skepticism so persistent?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It endures despite the fact that, as anyone who actually reads them knows, good graphic novels are absolutely capable of fostering self-reflection, initiating social change, promoting tolerance, stimulating the imagination.
All the things we value in traditional literature.
Precisely the same profound reasons routinely cited for the value and importance of traditional literature.
So what's the core issue here? Is it just prejudice?
Well, I think the fundamental issue underlying this persistent skepticism is a major misunderstanding. And if there's one core insight you take away from this deep dive today, it's this. Comics are a medium, not a genre.
Okay, break that down. Medium versus genre.
Right. It's crucial. A medium is how a story is told. In this case, it's through that unique interdependent combination of art and text, arranged sequentially on a page. That's the how.
Got it. Like film is a medium or prose is a medium.
Exactly. A genre, on the other hand, is the type of story being told: superhero, autobiography, fantasy, historical fiction, romance, whatever. That's the what?
So saying graphic novels are just superhero stories.
It's fundamentally misleading. It's like saying all movies are romantic comedies because you happen to catch one last weekend.
Yeah.
It completely misses the vast, diverse landscape of what the medium can actually encompass.
Okay, that makes sense.
And this unique combination, this medium of visuals and text working together, allows for conveying mood, setting, emotion in ways that words alone often struggle to do.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Imagine showing the pain of a character's inner world, not just through their thoughts in a caption box, but through actual physical distortions of the art on the page itself. Or maybe showing the oppressive weight of a society through stark, repeating geometric patterns in the architecture depicted.
Ah, I see. Things you can't easily do with just words.
Exactly. That's a dimension of communication a traditional novel simply can't replicate in the same way, and it's absolutely integral to the reading experience of a graphic novel.
So, okay, if graphic novels aren't just simplified books with pictures, if they're their own thing, as you said,
Yeah.
what are they, truly? What makes them tick?
Well, Will Eisner, who is a legendary figure, basically helped define the language of comics.
Right. Understanding comics is often cited. Oh, wait, that was McCloud. Eisner did comics and sequential art.
Right, Eisner. He believed that sequential art, that was his term for the form, could provide, and I quote, a dimension of communication that contributes, hopefully on a level never before attained, to the body of literature that concerns itself with the examination of human experience.
Wow. A level never before attained. That's a powerful claim for the medium.
It is. He saw immense potential there.
And this idea of a new dimension, it brings us right to the unique structure, doesn't it? The complexity.
Absolutely. It brings us to how they convey meaning, using not just one, but three distinct semiotic systems all working together at the same time.
3 systems. Okay, what are they?
First, you have the verbal system.
Yeah.
That's straightforward, the words, the text itself, dialogues, captions, sound effects, just like in a traditional novel, in a way.
Words. Got it.
Second, there's the visual system. This refers to the images themselves, the characters' expressions, the settings, the colors used, the objects drawn within the panels, the style of the art.
The pictures, basically.
Right. But critically, there's also the spatial system. This is the one that's often overlooked, but is incredibly powerful. This refers to the layout of the entire page, the arrangement and size of the panels, the empty space between the panels, often called the gutter, and the proximity of different elements on the page.
The layout itself carries meaning.
Immense meaning. Think about how an artist might use a series of small, cramped, maybe overlapping panels to convey a feeling of anxiety or claustrophobia.
Yeah.
Then suddenly, they might switch to a huge full-page spread, maybe even a two-page spread, for a moment of revelation, or to show something epic in scale. That spatial manipulation isn't just decoration. It's a critical part of the storytelling, guiding your eye and influencing your emotional response.
Huh. I never really thought about the gutters having meaning before.
They absolutely do. The reader has to infer what happens in that space between panels. It requires active participation.
So what this all means is that as readers, we have to go way beyond just understanding the words and phrases.
Far beyond.
We need to actively analyze the images, understand how the text and images are laid out together, grasp the sequential order, interpret the deliberate use of colors, fonts, perspective, even understand the cultural background influencing these choices.
Exactly. Researchers like Anstey, Boll, Pantaleo, and Serafini have all highlighted this. This multi-layered decoding demands much more active engagement than just decoding words on a page. It's a truly dynamic, immersive reading experience. It's work.
It sounds like work, but potentially very rewarding work.
Definitely. And what really stands out here is that this inherent complexity demands, well, a unique reading approach. As Douglas Walk put it very well in his book back in 2007, comics are not prose, they are not movies.
They're their own thing.
They're their own thing. They're not just text-driven with added pictures. They're a medium with its own specific devices, its own history of innovators, its own cliches, its own genres, its own freedoms. And the first step toward truly appreciating them is acknowledging that distinct nature and recognizing the sophisticated skills needed to navigate them properly.
Okay, so it requires specific skills. How do we understand the skills better?
Well, Serafini, back in 2012, proposed a really useful model for multimodal reading. It helps break down what's going on. He outlined 4 key roles that a multimodal reader performs when engaging with a text, like a graphic novel.
4 roles. Okay, what are they?
First, you act as a navigator. You're constantly determining your reading path, systematically shifting your attention between the verbal elements and the visual elements, deciding where your eye needs to go next. It's often not a simple left to right, top to bottom flow like traditional text.
Right, the eye darts around.
Exactly. Second, you become a designer. You're actively using all the different semiotic resources available, the words, the images, their arrangement, the colors, everything, to construct your own meaning from the text. You're putting the pieces together.
Okay, navigator, designer.
Third, you are an interpreter. You're giving meaning to the work based on your own prior knowledge, your cultural background, your experiences. That's similar to reading traditional text.
Makes sense.
And finally, you are an interrogator. You're questioning the text, looking at the social messages, the power relations that might be reflected within the work. Again, something good readers do with any text.
So interpreter and interrogator sound familiar from regular reading.
They are. But what's crucial to understand is that the first 2 roles, the navigator and the designer, are pretty unique to multimodal texts like graphic novels. They pose a particular, often unacknowledged challenge for readers who aren't familiar with this specific way of communicating.
That navigation and design part, that's where the complexity really lies for newcomers.
That's often where the struggle or the richness lies, yes. And this brings us to a really illuminating study by Jimenez and Meyer from 2016.
What do they look at?
They examined how expert readers, people really experienced with complex comics and graphic novels, actually constructed meaning. They watched how these readers intentionally shifted their attention between the textual details and the visual details.
And what did they find? How did it compare to, say, expert verbal readers?
The comparison was fascinating. They found that the expert verbal readers tended to start by looking at the verbal elements, first reading the words. Then maybe they'd review the visual and spatial components.
Okay.
But crucially, for these verbal experts, the nonverbal elements often didn't significantly deepen or change the understanding they had already built, primarily through reading the words. The pictures felt supplementary, not truly integral to their core understanding.
Ah, so like illustrations in a novel sometimes feel nice, but not essential.
Exactly. Whereas the experienced graphic novel readers approached it very differently. They typically started by scanning the visual and spatial elements first.
They looked at the pictures and layout before the words.
Generally, yes. To get an initial impression, what's the genre feel like? Who are the characters? What might the plot be about? Then they examine the verbal elements, the words.
Okay.
And here's the critical part. In a third stage, they actively synthesized all 3. the visual, the spatial, and the verbal.
Mm-hmm.
They wove them together to construct a much richer, more nuanced, and comprehensive meaning of the text.
So it wasn't words plus pictures, it was an integrated understanding.
Precisely. They weren't just reading words and looking at pictures separately. They were integrating them on a deeper cognitive level. The researchers concluded that graphic novels, especially those for adults, demand complex, non-linear reading. And that directly challenges the common assumption about how easy comics are to read.
Which brings us back to that paradox. If reading them is so complex, why are they so often seen as easy? Why push them for struggling readers?
Yeah, it's a real puzzle. And the answer often lies in something called cognitive overload.
Cognitive overload.
Yeah. Less experienced readers, especially if the reading task isn't carefully scaffolded for them, can feel totally flooded with different types of stimuli. That's a point McClanahan and Nottingham made in 2019.
Too much coming at them at once.
Exactly. So what do? They might focus primarily on the things that seem easier, maybe the simpler language or the most obvious visual cues. They end up just skimming the surface.
And miss the deeper stuff.
They end up missing those critical visual and spatial dimensions that are actually a significant, integral part of how the meaning is made in graphic novels. Serafini and Reed highlighted this in 2019 too. The perceived easiness often comes from a superficial read, not a deep engagement with the text's full multimodal richness.
It's like hearing a song for the first time and maybe only catching the main melody.
Perfect analogy. You miss all the intricate harmonies, the rhythm section, the lyrical nuance underneath that gives it real depth. You think you've got it, but you've only scratched the surface.
Okay, so we often assume students, right, especially today's kids, the visual generation, we think they'll automatically love graphic novels because they're so visual, so immediate.
That's the common assumption, definitely.
But here's where the narrative takes a really interesting twist. That assumption, it can be quite deceiving. Our sources actually challenge it directly.
How so?
Well, their research details experiences where both university students and high school students actively resisted reading graphic novels.
Resisted, even high schoolers.
Yes. And it was particularly true for university students who were training to become high school English teachers. You'd think they, of all people, would be open to new forms of literature, right?
You would think so.
Yeah.
What were their objections?
Listen to some of these quotes. They came directly from the study, and they weren't just isolated opinions. One student wrote, "Providing pictures strips away the young adult's creative and critical thinking about books."
Wow, okay, the imagination argument.
Exactly. Another said, "The combination of pictures and text in novels to me seems childish and doesn't allow readers to think critically."
Childish, there's that value judgment again.
And another, "There simply is not enough text to make me believe that it significantly encourages reading."
Not enough words equals not enough reading.
These weren't extreme cases. The researcher noted these arguments were representative of many students questioning whether it was even appropriate to teach graphic novels as literature.
And this wasn't just university students.
No, this resistance, even from a generation supposedly fluent in visual media, is apparently not uncommon based on conversations at professional conferences. It's a surprising pushback against a medium we might expect them to just readily adopt. It really makes you wonder why this knee-jerk reaction against something that's supposed to be easier.
And this brings us to another really crucial point. Social stigma. It's not just about academic perceptions. Students are also acutely aware of a significant social stigma attached to graphic novels among their actual peers.
Stigma from other kids.
Absolutely. Research by Hammond back in 2009 and also the author's own case study involving high school students found that participants knew about these stigmas, and it often detracted from the graphic novel's popularity. Some students saw them as puerile, childish or trivial,
Right.
while others saw the kids who read them as social misfits or, to use their actual term, nerds. So it's not just about whether it's good literature, it's about social standing, fitting in.
Being seen as a nerd for reading comics, that's rough.
It really is. And this social pressure can cause real emotional pain. The source shares this incredibly powerful anecdote about a student named Barry, a junior who loved comics.
What happened with Barry?
He said he felt genuinely ashamed when he had to call his friends to arrange going to the comic book store. He reflected on how his peers could just look at something that I find so beautiful and spit on it without giving a second thought.
Oh man, that's heartbreaking.
Isn't it? He even said, quite poignantly, it's to the point now where even kids that read comics are persecuted by other kids. It highlights the very real emotional impact these stigmas have on young readers who are passionate about the medium. Imagine loving an art form, only to have your friends, maybe even some teachers, dismiss it as worthless. That's a heavy burden for a young person to carry.
It really is. So this begs the question again. Are graphic novels really just this means to an end for struggling readers? Or do they offer something deeper, something more profound, despite this resistance and stigma?
Well, despite those social challenges and that initial resistance we talked about, the high school students in the study, they consistently suggested that graphic novels are capable of inspiring high-level thinking, of stimulating rich discussion, and of fostering aesthetic appreciation.
High-level thinking, rich discussion, aesthetic appreciation. Those sound like the goals of teaching any literature.
Exactly. They found that actually engaging with the visual narrative pushed them to make complex inferences, to decode symbolism in the art, and to connect the textual clues with the visual clues in ways that really deepen their understanding. It wasn't easy. It was challenging in a good way.
So the students who engaged with them actually found value.
They really did. Listen to these insights directly from the students themselves. They offer such a strong counter-narrative to the initial skepticism. Sarah, a sophomore, put it beautifully. I think all of us have taken away just as much from our graphic novel reading experience as we have from our classroom reading experience, maybe more.
Maybe more. Wow.
Yeah. And she continued. And I think there's just as much substance to graphic novels as there is to just regular literature. And I don't think teachers realize that.
That hits hard. I don't think teachers realize that.
Doesn't it? And another student remarked, very simply but profoundly, I didn't know they were going to have such a big impact on how I look at things in the world.
And that right there.
That's it. That is exactly what we hope for from any literature, from any art form. It's about opening minds, challenging perspectives, fostering that deeper engagement with the world around us.
Okay, so let's really tackle this head on. This popular belief, this stereotype that graphic novels are nothing but superhero capes, pow-bam-boom action, and simplistic plots.
The old stereotype, yeah.
Spoiler alert, everyone. That perception is profoundly mistaken, and our sources go to great lengths to absolutely shatter it.
It needs shattering.
We have to reiterate that crucial point we discussed earlier because it's just so foundational. The comics are a medium, not simply a genre.
Say it in. Medium, not genre.
Right. Yes. Superhero comics from the big publishers like Marvel and DC, they make up a highly visible, iconic part of comic culture. No denying that. But they are truly just one slice of a massive pie.
A very big, very colorful slice sometimes, but still just a slice.
Exactly. It's like saying movies are all romantic comedies. It completely ignores the vast landscape of cinematic storytelling. The medium of comics is how stories are presented through that unique blend of art and text in sequence. But what those stories are about, oh man, that can vary wildly. It covers an incredible breadth of thematic and genre diversity that just blows any simplistic stereotype out of the water.
So give us some examples. What kind of diversity we're talking about?
Okay, think about the sheer range. You have gripping autobiographies, like Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis. It powerfully details her upbringing during the Iranian Revolution, exploring identity, politics, coming of age, all in this visually distinct style.
A classic example. Widely taught now, too.
Or Sarah Glidden's How to Understand Israel in 60 Days or Less, a really personal travelogue digging into complex geopolitics and culture. Then you have major historical events brought to life with incredible impact. The obvious example is Art Spiegelman's Mouse.
The Pulitzer winner. Using mice and cats for Holocaust survivors. Unforgettable.
Exactly. Exploring intergenerational trauma and memory in a way words alone just couldn't. But it's not all serious. You can dive into quirky fantasy adventures like Brian Lee O'Malley's Scott Pilgrim vs. the World.
Which blends video game logic with romance and action. So much fun.
Totally. Or explore somber, surreal, philosophical narratives like Neil Gaiman's Death, The High Cost of Living. Death herself spends a day as a human. It's full of poignant reflections on life and mortality.
Gaiman's work often pushes those boundaries.
The medium even tackles really challenging subjects like mental health. Look at Emil Ferris's. My favorite thing is Monsters. It's visually dense, intricately drawn, combining mystery, coming of age, a young girl's inner world in 1960s Chicago. It's astonishing.
A powerhouse of a book.
And it's not just original works. You get adaptations of literary classics. You even get continuations of cult classic TV shows, like the Firefly comics, picking up where the show sadly left off.
Keeping the browncoats happy.
Exactly. And across this huge spectrum, these stories tackle universal human themes: trauma, love, loss, and self-discovery. Themes as serious and profound as anything you'd find in traditional literature.
And it's not just the themes and genres that have diversified, right?
Ah,
The characters themselves have evolved hugely.
how so?
Well, way back when, as one of our sources puts it quite nicely, to have your own comic book, a character pretty much had to be white, male, and, conventionally attractive. That was the default,
The square-jawed hero type.
pretty much. Nowadays, though, you find this incredible eclectic mixture of three-dimensional characters of all different races, religions, sizes, genders, ages, sexual orientations, and abilities. It's a much broader reflection of society.
That's a huge shift. Can you give some examples?
Oh, tons. Consider Storm from the X-Men. She shattered barriers as the first black superheroine way back when, or North Star, also X-Men, who made history as the first openly gay superhero.
Important milestones.
Definitely. Kathy Kane as Batwoman is now one of the most prominent gay characters in comics, headlining her own critically acclaimed series. You've got Miles Morales, the half-African, half-Latino teenager who became Spider-Man, offering such a fresh, inclusive take that resonates hugely.
We're huge now, yeah.
Then there's Oracle, Barbara Gordon, formerly Batgirl. After being paralyzed, she didn't disappear. She became Batman's invaluable informant, fighting crime from a wheelchair, using her incredible intelligence and tech skills that shows heroism beyond just physical prowess.
A great example of adapting and overcoming.
A personal favorite mentioned in the source, Willow Rosenberg from the Buffyverse comics. A Jewish lesbian witch who, as they point out, has saved the world multiple times with her immense power and, quote, all while remaining fully clothed.
Huh.
These characters offer depth, relatability, representation that was just missing in the early days. It shows a real evolution in how heroes and people are envisioned in the medium.
Okay, so the stories are diverse, the characters are diverse. What about the art? Because that's often the first thing people criticize: badly drawn, as Sterling North put it.
Right, that low-quality dismissal. It's just not accurate, full stop. Contrary to what you may think, our source emphasizes, there is no set method on how to draw comics.
No single comic book style.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
This results in that tapestry of covers with their own unique styles and colors you see lining the shelves. And even within the pages where artists might aim for some consistency on a teen book, you can still discern the fine touches and idiosyncrasies of different artists. Each brings their unique voice.
So what are some examples of this artistic diversity?
Oh man. To anyone who dismisses comic art, I'd say go look at the photorealistic covers by Joe Chen. They almost look like photos. Or the very distinct digital paintings of Adam Hughes, famous for his dynamic figures. Or the gritty, expressionistic style of Tim Sale. His work on Batman with deep shadows is iconic.
The Long Halloween, yeah. Instantly recognizable.
Or the stunning, ethereal watercolors Dustin Nguyen painted for series like Descender. Just beautiful.
Yeah.
And even the styles that look more simplistic, like Bruce Timm's designs for Batman, the animated series, or Brian Lee O'Malley's art in Scott Pilgrim, they're still incredibly full of life and have their own distinct flavors. They convey character and emotion with amazing economy.
So art in comics is subjective and varied, just like any other art form.
Exactly. You simply cannot generalize it as low quality. It's a dynamic, evolving visual language with countless dialects.
And even within the superhero genre itself, which gets stereotyped the most, that's evolved too, hasn't it?
Massively. It's absolutely not just about the good guy punches bad guy formula anymore, although those stories definitely still exist and can be fun.
But there's more now.
So much more. Modern superhero graphic novels, think of Alan Moore's Watchmen or Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns. These are deeply sophisticated works. They tackle immensely complex social and philosophical themes.
They really deconstruct the whole idea of superheroes.
They do. They explore the psychological toll of having power, the morality of vigilantism.
Right.
These are not simplistic tales by any stretch. They explore the human psyche, the concept of power, and the moral ambiguity of heroism. They ask really uncomfortable questions that resonate deeply with mature readers. They push the boundaries of what a superhero story can even be, showing the genre's capacity for profound commentary on the human condition.
Okay, so we've established this fascinating contradiction, right? We've seen graphic novels are complex works of art. They demand sophisticated reading skills. They even present challenges for experienced readers, including teachers.
Right. Definitely not always easy.
Yet at the same time, they're often promoted as being easier for reluctant readers, especially in schools. So how do we actually make sense of this apparent paradox?
It's the core tension, isn't it?
It really is. And a very recent study, this one titled Teachers' Experience of Reading Graphic Novels for Adults by Poyas and Elke Lehman, published just this year, 2024 shed some really fascinating light on this exact issue.
Oh, interesting. What did they do?
They focused specifically on language arts teachers reading an adult graphic novel called Tunnels. And the findings, well, they were quite surprising and challenged a lot of assumptions.
Like what?
Well, one of the most striking things was the huge familiarity gap among these educators. Nearly half, a full 44% of the teachers surveyed had no prior experience reading graphic novels.
Almost half. Wow.
Yeah, beyond maybe short comic strips they saw as kids in newspapers or whatever. Crucially, they had never learned about graphic novels as texts to be taught during their academic studies or their teacher training.
So nearly half the teachers were basically encountering this medium for the first time, formally.
Pretty much. Which means a huge portion of teachers might be entering classrooms without the foundational knowledge of this increasingly popular and, as we've discussed, complex medium. How can you effectively teach something you've never really engaged with yourself?
That's a massive gap in preparation.
It seems like it. And what's even more striking is the difficulty factor they reported. A significant 58%, well over half, found reading this graphic novel harder than reading a traditional verbal novel.
Harder, not easier.
Harder. And it wasn't just older teachers, even younger teachers who you might expect to be more comfortable with multimodal texts found it more challenging.
Why? What did they say made it difficult?
They identified several key reasons. Teachers reported confusion and difficulty following reading directions. Things like text bubbles in different places in every comic square panel made it hard to know where to read next. That's that navigator role Serafini talked about being tricky.
Right, the nonlinear path.
They also noted difficulty reading illustrations and connecting them to words, and a need for great effort to fill information gaps between the panels. That required actively using both verbal and visual thinking simultaneously, which demanded a different kind of cognitive processing than they were used to.
Juggling those systems we talked about?
Exactly. One teacher even lamented that the illustrations actually limit my ability to describe the scenes to myself using my imagination, which suggests a real reliance on traditional, purely verbal reading strategies that are profoundly challenged by the multimodal nature of graphic novels.
Interesting. They felt the pictures limited imagination rather than sparking it.
Yeah. And here's a truly counterintuitive finding from the study. Understanding the medium's characteristics, like learning about how graphic novels actually work with panels and gutters and visual cues that increase the perceived difficulty for these teachers.
Wait, learning more made it seem harder, not easier.
Exactly. It's as if the more they understood its true complexity, the less easy it seemed. The initial impression of simplicity faded away.
That is fascinating. But did they enjoy it, despite finding it difficult?
That's the other remarkable part. Despite these documented difficulties, a significant majority, 69%, actually enjoyed the reading experience.
Okay, so difficult but enjoyable. That happens with traditional books, too.
True. And interestingly, Arabic-speaking participants reported even higher enjoyment, 79%, compared to their Hebrew-speaking counterparts at 46%, even though they often found the text difficult to navigate.
Huh. Any theories why? Especially for the L2 speakers?
The researchers suggest this enjoyment, particularly for L2 speakers, might stem from that initial appeal of a colorful text, rich in images, with relatively few and simple words. It allows for a quick impression of the meaning. It feels less linguistically demanding at first glance.
An accessible entry point visually.
Right. But, and this is crucial, the study points out that this impression is not equivalent to understanding, and enjoyment does not do away with the difficulty of understanding the content, situation, and relationships presented in these complex texts.
Ah, so the enjoyment might be more superficial, not necessarily indicating deep comprehension.
That seems to be the implication. Enjoyment doesn't cancel out the difficulty or guarantee deep engagement with the layered meaning.
So what does this all tell us about education? About preparing teachers for the kinds of texts students are actually reading, or could be reading?
Well, the study strongly concludes that graphic novels are inherently intertwined. Verbal and visual texts. You simply cannot understand one without the other. They work together inextricably.
Right.
And this fundamentally requires what Wallner, back in 2017, termed comics literacy. It's a specialized form of literacy that goes beyond just traditional text decoding.
Comics literacy, a specific skill set.
Exactly. And the big aha here from the teacher study is that merely growing up in our visual digital world doesn't automatically grant you this comics literacy.
Just being young doesn't mean you know how to read them deeply.
Apparently not. As the study showed, even those teachers who were intuitively fluent in digital media still struggled. It highlights that simple intuition or exposure isn't enough to deeply engage with and interpret these complex, often challenging works of art. It's a learned skill, like any other form of literacy.
So the path forward seems pretty clear then, doesn't it? What needs to happen?
The recommendation from the study is explicit and quite urgent. There is a pressing need to update the teacher training curricula in Israel and worldwide in order to equip language arts teachers with the tools of reading, interpreting, and mediating such texts.
Training needs to catch up with the reality of modern text.
Absolutely. And this isn't just about acknowledging graphic novels as, a fleeting trend, or just appropriating them as mere tools to achieve other learning objectives, like getting reluctant readers started.
Not just stepping stones anymore.
No. It's about truly embracing it as a worthwhile form of reading material in its own right, recognizing its distinct artistic and literary merit.
So what would that look like in practice? Dedicated modules in teacher training.
That seems to be the implication. Dedicated modules on multimodal literacy, perhaps on the history and theory of comics, and definitely practical strategies for teaching graphic novels, not just as remedial tools, but as rich, complex texts worthy of deep literary analysis, just like a poem or a novel.
Because good graphic novels, just like good traditional literature, are absolutely capable of moving readers to reflect on unexamined aspects of their lives.
Exactly. And fostering that high-level thinking, stimulating rich discussion that, after all, the core goal of literature, regardless of the medium it happens to be presented in.
Well said.
So, wow, we've really journeyed from that historical scorn and those early, often quite harsh misconceptions about comics, all the way to the nuanced, complex debates surrounding graphic novels today.
It's been quite a ride, from Sterling North to Serafini.
It has. We've explored how they function as this truly sophisticated multimodal art form. We've challenged some widespread assumptions about both student perceptions and even teacher perceptions. And hopefully, we've championed their incredible diversity and depth, showing they are far, far beyond just simple superhero stories.
Hopefully busted a few myths along the way.
That's the goal. And remember, this isn't just some abstract academic debate. It really impacts how we all engage with stories, how educators teach, and ultimately what we even consider literature in our rapidly evolving, incredibly visually driven world.
It changes the definition, potentially.
It really could. So if you've been sleeping on graphic novels, maybe if you've been swayed by some of those old stereotypes we talked about, it is truly time to wake up.
Give them a try.
Seriously. Whether you're into epic adventures or quiet introspective memoirs or mind-bending philosophical musings or powerful historical narratives, there is absolutely a graphic novel out there waiting to capture your heart and your mind. Pick one up, dive in, and experience their unique power for yourself.
And maybe this brings up a crucial question for you, the listener, to consider as we wrap up. In a world where visual information increasingly dominates our communication, shapes our understanding, if we don't fully understand and appreciate complex, multimodal texts like graphic novels, what critical insights might we actually be missing?
What are we losing if we ignore them?
Exactly. What insights are we missing from the very stories that are shaping our life, visually and textually? How might our very definition of what it means to be well-informed need to expand to truly encompass this rich tapestry of interwoven textual and visual meaning?
That's a deep question to ponder.
It is. But bottom line, it's literature, it's art, and yeah, it can also be seriously entertaining too.